Well guys, I'd say it's high time we return to the monster-infested corridors of Castlevania. When we last tackled this series, we took a look at the major paradigm shift from level-based side-scrolling action platformer to a more sprawling, open-ended style of game with RPG elements that producer Koji Igarashi would label as the search action genre, and us Yanks would label as Metroidvania. Castlevania Symphony of the Night would go on to be so critically and commercially successful that Igarashi-sensei would be appointed by Konami as producer of the entire series going forward. And now that we've gotten one of the most celebrated entries in the series out of the way, I would now like to turn your attention to the 3 games succeeding it, the Castlevania games for Game Boy Advance. And frankly, these 3 games are the ones I was really chomping at the bits to make reviews on, because these are the ones that got me into the Castlevania series. And whenever I see people mention this series, I almost never hear these 3 games get mentioned. And that's a real shame because I honestly think that these 3 are some of the best the series has to offer in terms of the Metroidvania-style games. So I'd like to give them their fair due. 1997's Symphony of the Night would go on to be so well received that Konami was keen to replicate its success by having future installments follow its gameplay structure, putting the player in one large castle to explore gradually as opposed to individual levels in the style of the NES and Super NES games. Though for as influential as Igarashi-sensei would be to the series going forward, him and his development team at Konami's Tokyo studio would actually not be involved in this next title. Instead, the reins were given to Konami's Kobe department, who beforehand had worked on the Nintendo 64 titles, the first of which was not particularly well received. That sounds like a recipe for disaster, having the team behind one of the worst received games in the series tackle the next mainline game. But what we actually ended up with is what I consider one of the most underrated entries in the series. The Game Boy Advance launch title, and my first Castlevania game, 2001's Castlevania Circle of the Moon. The year is 1830, and the Lord of Darkness, Count Dracula, has spent the last 10 years sealed away in a magic casket. One of Dracula's vampire minions, Camilla, no, not Carmilla this time, has brought the casket he's been sealed inside to her castle in Austria to revive him. Mere seconds after Dracula is released, Morris Baldwin, the vampire killer who sealed him away 10 years ago, arrives with his son Hugh and his apprentice Nathan Drake. God damn it, that's the second time now. Nathan Graves. Dracula is still weak, his powers having faded in the 10 years he's spent sealed away, but before our heroes can use this to their advantage and get the upper hand on him, Dracula destroys the floor underneath Nathan and Hugh, leaving Morris behind with him. Somehow, Nate and Hugh's legs don't shatter from the fall, and Hugh runs off in a mad dash to take out Dracula before he can regain his former power, urging Nate to stay out of his way. Wanting to save Morris as much as Hugh does, the game begins as you trek across Camilla's castle. So yeah, a little bit of a minor change-up this time around, but you're not actually exploring Dracula's castle, but rather Camilla's. That doesn't make it any less dangerous, though, as there are monsters everywhere. This is a Castlevania game, after all. Despite this castle not belonging to the Count, it does contain many of the same types of locations as the one in Symphony. You've got your catacombs, long hallways, a clock tower-style area, cathedral, areas that have become iconic to the franchise without it feeling like a complete rehash of Symphony. The castle isn't as large as the one found in Symphony, more than likely due to the portable nature of the game, but it contains enough variety in its design and enemy selection that it remains pretty engaging to explore, at least in my opinion. Speaking of its design, I gotta say, for a GBA game in 2001, a launch game no less, this is a really good-looking game. Again, it's an obvious downgrade visually from Symphony, there's no polygons or particle effects, and the animation might be a bit limited in comparison, but the areas are still very rich and detailed for a 2D game with sprite-based graphics. Even now, 20 years later, the graphics are still charming in their own way. Though, if you're playing this game on an original Game Boy Advance system, the game's dark graphics do come with a price. Before the time when screens with backlights became the standard, playing this game in particular with the original GBA's dim screen was something of a challenge, as it was very difficult to see anything. Now granted, this is a complete non-issue today if you're playing this on, say, a DS or on the Wii U's Virtual Console, but this was a pretty widespread criticism of the game back when it first released. Hell, I should know, my first time playing this was on an original non-backlit GBA, and I can personally attest that it was hard to see things at times without proper lighting right next to me. What I can say is an improvement visually over Symphony is that you get a health meter right over your magic meter as opposed to a number. It's a small change, sure, but I found this game's health meter to be much more helpful at a glance when I needed to see how much health I had left, instead of a number tucked all the way over to the top left-hand side of the screen. Circle of the Moon has good visual presentation, but it's definitely not lacking in the sound department either. Out of all 3 games on the GBA, heck, maybe even all of the post-Symphony games, I think Circle of the Moon may actually have my personal favorite soundtrack. Many, if not all, of the songs in this game are incredibly well-done renditions of classic tracks from the series' old games. This game has my absolute favorite versions of the Sinking Old Sanctuary and Vampire Killer. Every single song in this game is amazing. I just love it. Bosses tend to guard an item that enables you to perform new abilities like the double jump, the ability to jump off of walls, and the high jump. And using these new abilities to reach previously unreachable areas is how you progress through the game, as is typically the case with these Metroidvanias. The thrill of finding new areas as you gain these new abilities is still very much alive and well here. I slightly touched on this already, but it helps that these areas are detailed and varied, and the soundtrack definitely amplifies its dark atmosphere. I'll still defend this game's visuals to this day, even 20 years later. God, 20 years. I'm getting old. What hasn't aged as gracefully are the controls. They're a bit on the stiff side. For starters, for the first 5 or so minutes of the game, you can't even run, until you find a special item that allows you to do so. Running is done by pressing left or right on the D-pad twice. It's weird and kinda unnecessary, but once you get used to it, it's not so bad. It's just kind of a confusing design choice. Despite there being no reference to any of the members of House Belmont, Nate still comes equipped with a whip as his primary weapon. Gone from Symphony in the Night are the types of weapons like swords, axes, stabs, and knuckle dusters, but you can enchant your whip or turn it into different types of weapons. More on that in a bit. The number of sub-weapons from Symphony has also been cut down to just 5. For me, it isn't a huge problem because I really only stuck to a couple in Symphony, but I still think it's worth mentioning. But that won't be the only arsenal you'll be playing with, as this game introduces a new mechanic called the Dual Setup System, or DSS for short. Every so often, when slaying a specific enemy, they'll drop a purple card. There are 20 of these in the game, 10 action cards and 10 attribute cards. Combining an action card on the top row with an attribute card on the bottom row and activating its ability with the left trigger will grant you either a magical ability or an immense stat boost. Using these consumes your MP, but it'll slowly regenerate when not using any magic. So while you technically can use other weapons than the whip if you're using the right card setup, it uses MP every time you use them, so it's not quite the same as it is in Symphony, or some of the later games in the series. There's definitely a level of experimentation that comes into play when combining these cards together, and that adds to the overall fun of the game, in my opinion. These DSS cards are only held by certain enemies, which appear in specific parts of the castle, and you're bound to find a handful of them playing through the game normally, but if you want to find all 20 of them, you might want to break out that online walkthrough. And even then, you may be killing the same type of enemy over and over again before it finally drops. I don't feel like you'd really need all 20 DSS cards in order to get through the game, but there are some super helpful abilities you gain from them. Not only can enemies drop these DSS cards, but restorative items like potions and mine restores can also be farmed from fallen enemies. But because enemies drop them so rarely if you're not boosting your luck stat, they can be a pain to farm when you're running low on them. And not having enough of them can make boss fights pretty hard. Certainly doesn't help that out of the 3 GBA games, this one's got some of the toughest boss fights. Now you're probably asking, why don't you just buy some potions then? Symphony of the Night let you do it. Well, unfortunately, in a rather surprising move for a post-Symphony game, the one immediately following it no less, there are no shops in this game. There's no gold or currency of any kind, so you either have to farm healing items from specific enemies, make liberal use of your save points which do fully heal you, or rely on a specific DSS combination to heal yourself if you found the correct cards to use it. I did notice that this game tries to compensate for this by sprinkling in HP max increases fairly frequently, which does restore all your health, but it is jarring to see a post-Symphony game without easy access to healing items. Bosses don't even drop that red orb that fully heals you when you beat them in this game. I honestly don't know if this was an intentional design choice or not, so you're gonna have to try and not play this recklessly. Not having a reliable way to heal yourself aside from making a mad dash back to the save points does make this game a lot harder than it probably should have been. I know when I was younger, it took me a very long time to finish this game because I didn't have a reliable way to heal aside from save points. So you may have to do a little level grinding here and there. You also can't sell anything either. So you'll end up with like 5 or 6 leather armors or something, but since you can only equip one body armor of any kind at a time, you'll just have a bunch of extras that you can't do anything with. You can equip a set of arm-type armor for each of your arms, so that makes sense to have multiple, but in that case, anything more than 2 is just excessive. Though, if you are feeling particularly cheeky, you could exploit a rather infamous glitch this game contains, where activating one of your available DSS combinations, then quickly pausing the game to switch over to cards you haven't collected yet, can activate an ability you wouldn't normally otherwise have, like, say, the really good healing spell. I didn't do this during my first 2 playthroughs, mainly because I didn't know this glitch existed, but I was still able to beat the game. I don't recall farming a lot for high potions, nor had I unlocked the healing spell legit, so it's totally possible to beat the game without it, but having purchasable healing items would have made the overall game so much more manageable. Alright, I've banged on enough about that. I guess complaining about difficulty in a Castlevania game is like going outside in a heavy thunderstorm and then complaining that you got drenched. I'm honestly kinda in a tough spot with this game. I want to recommend it so badly because what this game does do right, it does it really right. I know this game probably won't be for everybody, and I may even be more than a little biased since this was my first Castlevania game, but I still find the core gameplay to be a lot of fun. The atmosphere and soundtrack are flat out amazing, and the DSS mechanic is a lot of fun to screw around with, even if finding the cards in the first place can be a bit of a pain in the ass. Not to mention, it has some of my favorite boss designs in the series, and I genuinely still think that even 20 years later, the game looks great. Aesthetically speaking, it's one of my favorite games ever. I may recommend you check out the other 2 GBA games first, just because of all the gameplay tweaks that were made in those entries, and because this game isn't particularly too beginner-friendly. I know I keep bringing this up, but if this game had handled its inventory management differently and actually had purchasable healing items and equipment, it'd be more than enough for me to give this game more than just a cautious recommendation to series newcomers. I know I refer to this game as one of the most underrated in the series, and I still stand by that, but I'm also well aware of the design choices that hold it back from being a game that everyone can really enjoy. While loose cartridges for less than $30 are still floating around on eBay, it's also readily available as a digital download on the Wii U's Virtual Console, which is how I captured footage for this video. For one last little history lesson, when Koji Igarashi took over production of the series in 2002, several Castlevania games were retroactively removed from the series' official timeline. Circle of the Moon was among them, later being referred to by Igarashi as a side story. Despite that, though, this game would go on to be a critical and commercial success, and the first Castlevania game to sell over 1 million copies. Igarashi would return full-time to the series with the next game released the following year, 2002's Castlevania Harmony of Dissonance. And how does that game fare with Symphony of the Night's acclaimed producer back in control of the series? Well, when we return to the Castlevania series, we'll see for ourselves.